Welcome to Plugged In, Exploring Energy, a podcast miniseries with Constellation, where we explore the evolving landscape of energy solutions. I'm your host, Chuck Hanna, Vice President of National Accounts and Solutions at Constellation. In each episode, we bring industry leaders and experts to discuss the latest innovations, challenges, and opportunities in the energy sector. On this episode of Constellation's Plugged In, we're going to discuss CEBA's views on sustainability policy and what's trending and needed for the industry to survive. I'd like to welcome Rich Powell, who is the CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Association, known as CEBA, and also the Clean Energy Buyers Institute. Rich, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it and look forward to our discussion and your insights. Let's start by telling us more about yourself, your role, and your organization.
Well, Chuck, first, huge thanks to you, to everybody in the Constellation team for having me. So, as you said, Rich Powell, the CEO of CEBA and our sister institute, CEBA, the Clean Energy Buyers Institute. Our organization has just north of 400 members. And of those, about 200 are buyers of electricity. So we represent the very largest buyers of electricity in the United States and increasingly around the world. The buyers are all united with the common purpose of achieving electricity systems that are low cost and reliable and carbon emissions free. And that probably begins in the US and gradually will extend around the rest of the world as well. We're also very lucky to have a number of energy producer members in the association, including very lucky to have Constellation in the membership and on our board, which we're thrilled about. We're not a very old organization, only about 5 years old, founded in 2019. But in that time, our members have done some pretty extraordinary things. So as of Q4 last year, the CEBA membership is contracted for more than 100 gigawatts of carbon-free electricity just in the United States alone. So, that would make our members collectively by far the largest state in the US, all clean, or about the size of Italy in terms of total electricity procurement, which I was thinking a fun statistic. So we're sort of the largest single demand signal for carbon-free electricity in the Western Hemisphere.
Thanks so much, Rich. Appreciate the overview and pretty amazing all the things that the membership have accomplished in a relatively short period of time. So let's get into our dialogue here. Can you give us an overview about CEBA's sustainability vision for 2030 and beyond? And maybe mention some of the key milestones that CEBA has set in this period of time, and then how they align with the broader global sustainability initiatives you outlined, if you would.
So when you think about the global power sector, obviously you've got a lot of grids all around the world. Even within the United States, you have a lot of grids. You actually have a really, really complex sector. And our goal is not just for our members' own power to be supplied by clean electricity, but for everyone's power to be supplied by clean electricity. Because when they think about it, we have some of the largest, most sophisticated buyers in the world. They use I'll call them both elegant and complex instruments like virtual power purchase agreements and clean transition tariffs in regulated settings to buy that clean electricity. And they acknowledge that not every buyer, certainly not every residential buyer, and even most medium-sized and small businesses wouldn't be able to do electricity buying in the same way that they are. And so they're very focused on how can they use their collective buying power and their collective voice in policy conversations to drive a grid that's clean for everyone, so that everyone at some point will be able to just buy reliable, low-cost, carbon emissions-free electricity by default. That's just what will come out of power lines and power sockets everywhere. And so to do that, we have a lot of goals along the way. So, to start, we focus on making sure that our members' voluntary commitments to buying clean electricity are as high impact as they can be. And so that brings us into places like the rules around greenhouse gas reporting and accounting. It brings us into training a lot of companies on how to do this sort of clean energy buying. That's both in the US and increasingly it's around the world. And it also brings us into working with very specific sectors that have specific challenges. So the real estate industry, for example, or the data center industry. So first we work on making everybody's voluntary commitments impactful. Second, we work on getting government and unnecessary burdensome regulation that's slowing that down out of the way. And so we're very focused on reforming the federal permitting system so that we can put more generation onto the grid as quickly as possible and expand grids as quickly as possible, both the grids we have and the new wires that we need, and also making sure that markets are designed in ways that can get us new clean electricity as quickly as possible in as many places as possible, both within the US and around the world. And then lastly, we focus on what are the other things that can be done once you've sort of done everything you can to make voluntary demand signals working. And once you've streamlined all the processes, what are the other things you can do to lever all of that up? And so we think a lot, in this moment of load growth again in the US about how we make sure as much of that growth is met with clean electricity as possible. So that brings us into places like in the US, federal clean energy tax incentives and advanced manufacturing incentives. It brings us into making sure that new clean firm technologies are available. So if our members want to put in place small modular reactors or enhanced geothermal systems or gas with carbon capture, all the clean firm technologies, so that one day those things are there and as commercially available as solar and wind and existing nuclear are today. And so we focus a lot on all that as well.
That's a lot. Very encompassing.
It's a lot. It's a big energy system out there. And that's mostly just in the US. We're also, we're working in markets around the world, particularly in East Asia, on opening those up as well. There are many places that our members have operations or that their supply chains have operations where it's very difficult to buy. In many cases, it's difficult to buy any power that's not controlled by often like a state-owned monopoly in those places. And certainly to buy clean electricity in those places is often very difficult. And so we're working on opening up more of those markets so that our members have more choice and more access.
Yeah. So Rich, you've touched on quite a few areas and want to get more insights in terms of what do you see as some of the biggest regulatory changes and challenges, and also industry shifts regarding sustainability. And I was interested, as we were talking earlier, that you mentioned a couple things in terms of, not solely focused on sustainability and meeting the clean energy goals that your members have set out to achieve both individually as well as for the overall markets. But you also touched on a couple other areas like low cost, reliability in terms of being priorities for the members. And then in your last response, you also mentioned this high growth that's expected to be realized in the marketplace around some of the data center AI expectations out there. So how do you manage all that? And how do you see that in terms of some of the regulatory changes and industry shifts, if you would, please?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chuck. So I'm going to start with the end of that because I think that's maybe the most important thing right now, at least in North America, and everything else stems from that. I would expect every listener at this point to this podcast has heard we're back in growth mode in the U.S. electricity sector. But the important thing is we weren't there in the last 20 years. I mean, we have grown this fast in the past, as recently as the 90s, at least in relative terms. We've done this before, but it's been a long time. And frankly, the system as a whole is rusty when it comes to rapidly bringing on large amounts of new electricity and expanding the system. And so kind of everything else flows from that. So if suddenly you're going from flat power demand, where there are significant changes going on within the system, but those changes are, frankly, particularly traditional fuels and particularly some very old coal plants going offline and being replaced by a mix of gas and solar and wind, right? But basically, we're moving deck chairs within a ship that is basically moving in one direction, right? But it's not, the overall direction of the ship is not changing. Suddenly, to take the whole thing and put it, and to turn the whole massive thing into growth mode very quickly is a very different proposition. So, for example, we didn't have to worry that much about the grid itself over the last 20 years because these resources were coming up and these resources were going down. But the grid we had was largely sufficient to move around the electrons that we needed for the whole country. Suddenly, the grid itself is becoming quite strained with all of this new demand and with all these new resources that are attempting to go onto the grid to meet all that new demand. And it's leading to, in some parts of the country, really significant reliability issues, especially combined with the increasingly extreme weather that we're all seeing and experiencing. And it's leading to significantly higher prices in parts of the country, which obviously they're neither great for all the biggest buyers of electricity in the country who are paying the bills, nor are they good for all of our other customers, right? And so, every additional 20 or 30 bucks that somebody has to spend a month on their electricity bills, or 20 or 30 bucks a month that they can't spend in some of our very, very large retail clients, or, with some of our very large high-tech clients buying devices and other things. And so we care a lot about the system and the affordability of the system, both for ourselves and for the broader economy. And that is becoming challenged. And so, I mean, obviously the first thing we got to do is shake the rust off here. And a big part of that is reforming our permitting system. And so we have to do it all. We have to build more generation very rapidly around the country. We've got to upgrade the grid that we have today with grid enhancing technologies and other things where we can get a lot more out of the grid as it stands right now. And we've got to expand the grid. So we've got to build more wires in more places so that we can move electricity efficiently around amongst all that new generation and all that new load. That is going to require federal legislation, fundamentally. There's a lot that can be done administratively, but every administration in the last 20 years has attempted to make administrative reforms to fix our permitting system. And frankly, an administration cannot unilaterally do enough to sustainably fix and improve this system. And so new legislation is going to be required. CEBA was very involved at the end of last year in attempting to get a piece of legislation called Manchin-Barrasso that came out of the Senate across the finish line. Didn't quite get there at the end of last year in the lame duck, but we're very hopeful that this year in this Congress, we can get that conversation started again and hopefully have a great outcome in this Congress on reforming the permitting system.
Yeah, interesting. I like your term of rusty when you talk about the approach to facing this expected significant load growth. I'm going to start using that in some of my conversations as well. I like that.
I don't mean to say that the wires themselves are rusty or that the gear is rusty. I mean the system, the permanent.
Yeah. Right. The wires don't rust. That's a good point.
Right,
We're not suggesting that. So again, you've touched on a lot there. So can you give us a little bit more insight in terms of how you try and balance more of these short-term ebbs and flows in terms of some of the priorities that you've set versus some of the longer-term vision and innovation? And then, the other thing you mentioned that you're focused on is these federal legislation changes and how you manage all that in terms of some of these nearer term focus areas versus longer term. How do you balance all that with so much transition underway?
Yeah. So we just have to admit it's going to be tricky here over the next couple of years. I'll give you an example. This last week or 2 weeks ago, one of the big grids around the country, MISO, put forward a proposal that would have allowed some assets to sort of circumvent the normal interconnect process in that region to quickly get new generation up and running in the region. PJM had a similar proposal a few months ago as well. And so we as CEBA suggested that kind of thing should be handled very, very carefully. So obviously we're going to have instances where there are extraordinary moments where new assets have to be allowed in very, very quickly to meet a very specific reliability challenge. Nobody wants a grid to go down. Nobody wants extraordinary price spikes in a region. And, fundamentally, we have to be focused on reforming the interconnect processes in these regions so that the standard process works for everyone and can rapidly bring new generation on into the grid. And so striking just the right balance so that we got a system set up that's clear and transparent and open and that we're sure is going to get commercially ready units in to solve some very specific problems, so to fight a fire on the grid somewhere, but not to inadvertently break the existing queue or create some second line to get things on. And so this is going to happen continuously over the next decade as we shake the rust off and we get back into this. And I think what we have to always treat as our North Star is the idea that while this seems extraordinary, this next 5 years seems extraordinary, all of the projections show that this is just the beginning. And that let's call it round numbers, 100 to 150 gigawatts that we've got to add by 2030 to our grid, that will pale in comparison to the 300 or 400 gigawatts that we add in the 2030s, which will again pale in comparison to the terawatt that we add in the 2040s as we electrify more of our economy and grow our industries and all this sort of stuff. And so we really have to be thinking about building a system today that is actually capable of laddering up to that incredible future where we're more than doubling the size of our grid over the next 25 years.
Yeah, it's a good perspective in terms of trying to think longer term and at much higher level what this will look like down the road versus some of the nearer term challenges that we're all trying to work through across the various fronts that you mentioned. Can you share a specific initiative that CEBA has implemented that is making a significant impact? You've given us a couple examples in terms of your responses, but can you share some other ones in terms of what you're doing and what your organization has done in terms of some other significant impacts?
Well, I'll start with this is going to sound really basic, but as of 13 years ago, only three major US companies had actually bought sizable amounts of clean electricity. Those were founding members of CEBA. So this was General Motors and Google and Walmart. Today, about 235 companies have bought significant amounts of clean power. So that's how you get up to that 100 gigawatts number. And along the way, hundreds of those companies were trained on how to buy clean power by the Clean Energy Buyers Association. It's a big part of what we did in our early days, and we continue to run these boot camps today. And so just that basic industry standard setting and alignment and practice building has been hugely impactful to sort of train this whole cohort of companies on how to drive forward. And what's so exciting about it to me is, 100 gigawatts is a lot, but just this last year, we worked with Wood Mackenzie, one of the great analytics firms, to try to get a sense of what's actually the total size of that? What's the total upside in corporate US clean power demand? And they found that by 2035, total US clean power demand amongst the Fortune 1000 would be 275 gigawatts. So that's about 25% of our round numbers, about 25% of our entire grid at that point. So it's not just exciting that we've kind of got to 100, but that there's another 175 at least headroom to go just to satisfy the demand of very large electricity customers around the country. And so we're really excited about continuing that drive. And then relatedly, we are taking that same approach. And now with our Global Academy, we're training companies around the world on how to do this. Obviously, it's a slightly different, much more virtual model where we're working with folks in a lot of different time zones, but in places like Vietnam and in a few big states in India where power demand is going through the roof from new economic activity and where particularly supply chain partners of US companies are getting really active, we're finding ways to train companies active there as well, which is really exciting, because the US is a big market and we have a lot of emissions, but from an emissions perspective and a total electricity demand perspective, it's really all out in the rest of the world. And in particular, it's in East and South Asia. And so we're really excited to be able to extend the impact of what all these amazing companies are doing there as well.
Yeah, very interesting. It's pretty amazing, as you said, the pioneers and the founders you mentioned of your organization and how, their experience in sharing that training, many others have evolved the industry so quickly in a relatively short period of time. So,
it's still evolving fast. And so, a lot of that, again, was done through virtual power purchase agreements. Now we're finding ways to work more. And that's an instrument you particularly use in the deregulated markets, the wholesale power markets. We're also finding new ways to work in the vertically integrated utility markets as well. That requires kind of different deal technology, if you will. But more of our members are finding ways to do that and advance that. It's often particularly good for technologies that I know are close to Constellation's heart, sort of the clean, firm technologies. So that whole process continues, and it's really exciting.
So you mentioned some grid enhancing technologies in our earlier discussions today. Can you share what you see some of the emerging technologies in this space that's going to continue to enable areas like energy storage, AI, other advanced grid infrastructure type applications in the next decade or so?
Absolutely. Well, so obviously it starts with things that are effectively visibility and intelligence and monitoring of the grid we have today. So technologies like line vision and others to just give you a much better sense about what's actually happening on existing grids and then allow for things like dynamic line rating and rerouting and all those sorts of things, just so we're getting as much as we possibly can. I think most folks don't realize that the grid we have today is built for the peaks, not for its average times. But that means that on average, the grid's asset utilization is often 50% or below. And most folks trying to optimize an asset say, oh my gosh, you're only using something 50% of the time. That's really unusual. I think Constellation runs its nuclear fleet like 97% of the time. And so you want to find ways to use the assets you have much, much more effectively. So it starts with technologies like that. And then it moves to, well, what are the things that we could do to significantly upgrade the grid we have today? So same poles, but often new wires and new gear. And so that'd be things like advanced conductors, and maybe one day things like high temperature superconductors. So rather than running on the wires we have today, advanced wires with ceramic materials and, integrated cooling that maybe could get us 5 to 10 times as much electricity moving along the same kinds of wires and the same distances and would be incredibly transformative to our system. And then lastly, I'll just say, defined broadly, I think grid enhancing technology should also include things like virtual power plants and other measures that are also dynamically adjusting the demand side of the equation in addition to the generation side of the equation. There's so much more that we could get out of that. There's so much flexibility in our system we're not taking advantage of today, but we could, given all of our monitoring and dispatch capability in our modern economy, finding ways to do that, finding ways to allow our companies to activate those opportunities and incent those opportunities, which don't really exist today. And I say that in part because those things could move very, very quickly. There aren't many opportunities that could move as quickly as we need new demand over the next few years. But some of these virtual power plant and other flexibility measures could potentially move that quickly.
How much is this focus around policy shifts at various levels, so to speak? You've mentioned that in some instances. And how involved are you and your organization on the utility ISO side of things to enable a lot of these grid enhancing technologies to come into the marketplace? Like, how do you manage all that? And how involved are you across those different fronts beyond kind of the competitive market world that we live in?
Yeah. Well, so our members are in all 50 states, and we're active in every single power market. And I believe probably in every rate case in the country. There might be one or two that we're on it, but we're collectively there. CEBA obviously is not a huge organization, so we have to pick our battles and find places that we can best help and assist our members in many of those places. We are quite engaged, as you say, in the existing competitive markets. In some places, that's making sure that markets that are really successful right now, and in particular, I'll say ERCOT, don't have modifications that make them less successful, right? So we've been the Texas Energy Buyers Association, our terrific affiliate in Texas, has been very involved in making sure that legislation, for example, that has the noble intention of improving resilience of the Texas grid, which is obviously very, very important, doesn't inadvertently disadvantage new generation that can rapidly come into that grid. So we have to mind the store in some of those places. And then in other places, so the vertically integrated models, for example, we're working directly with utilities and PUCs on finding ways that we can bring things like grid enhancing technologies and other sort of near-term opportunities into those. For example, we worked over the past year and a half with the Georgia PUC and with Georgia Power on a sort of a bring your own clean energy program. So technically speaking, a targeted sort of tariff program where our members could identify and bring projects into the system like new generation projects or like GETS projects that would offset demand for up to, I think, 1.5 GW in the coming years. And so that requires kind of really deep tissue work with the specific utility and the specific PUC in a place where our members are really active and have a rapidly growing grid. But we're hoping that we can use that to then create sort of replicable models that we can bring around to the rest of the country.
Very interesting. So we've covered a lot, and you've given us great insights across many fronts: competitive markets, the vertically integrated policy, technologies. What are some of the other things that you're focused on that we haven't touched on? It's kind of an open-ended question just to get insights beyond some of the specifics that I've had for you. What would you like to share? Yeah.
Well, this episode may date itself quickly because things change very, very quickly in Congress. But as we sit right now in early April of 2025, the largest ever piece of legislation is being negotiated in the U.S. Congress. And so this is the reconciliation bill that will reauthorize and extend the 2018 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So that's core things like maintaining the corporate tax rate where it is and other things. And it's a massive piece of legislation, and finding ways to enact that legislation without further increasing our debt and deficit and risking even more inflation and more high interest rates to have to control that inflation. It's just a really tough balancing act for this Congress right now. I greatly sympathize and thank the members of Congress currently in the seats for doing this thing. One of the potential issues in that is what becomes of some of the core tax incentives, especially for new clean energy generation, and secondarily to existing clean energy generation, like the U.S. nuclear fleet. What happens to those tax credits through this update to the legislation? And so we've been doing a lot of modeling and analysis on, what would the impacts of tweaking this or changing that be to the overall U.S. electricity system and electricity prices? And then secondarily, what would it do to our ability to buy new clean power into the system? Because, as we discussed before, we have to think about both of those issues. And so one thing that has been discussed is a modification to they're called the tech neutral tax credits. They came into existence at the beginning of this year. They cover all new, zero and very low emission generating technologies. So we finally have kind of a level playing field for all the new stuff. So whether it's nuclear or solar or hydro or wind or geothermal or even combustion technologies with carbon capture on them, they all have one regime now, which is a really good thing. We've kind of gotten out of picking winners and losers amongst all the different technologies. If those credits went away during a time of load growth, like we're seeing now, we have found that national electricity prices would rise very significantly. So nationwide, as much as 8% just in the next few years. In some states, significantly more than that. So we'd have states that might see 20 and even 30% increases, both on the residential consumer side and on this quote unquote C&I rate. So, commercial and industrial rates as well that our members pay. And so we've been trying to educate members of Congress about the importance of taking all this into account as they're making these updates and making sure that trying to do good things to keep the grid affordable and reliable, but they don't inadvertently greatly increase electricity costs as they go through this system. So our hope is that those credits are maintained. Obviously, some modifications are going to have to be made to everything as part of that package, but our hope is that they're maintained alongside some of the advanced manufacturing credits and a few other things. And that, we find a way to work through, again, get the rust off the system over the next couple of years so that in the future, we won't have to have all of this federal policy in place that are driving incentives into different parts of the market, and so that the market can just be solving that itself. But again, rusty. So it would be very helpful to have these in place for the next couple of years. We think of them as greasing the system as we get back up to speed.
So a couple things, as we've discussed, you provided tremendous insights and great content in terms of what our podcast listeners have gained. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll point also to your content-rich website, no pun intended there, in terms of the CEBA, to continue to follow a lot of the activity in terms of what you've shared with our audience today is another resource in terms of what our listeners can keep up to date in terms of all these exciting things that you and the CEBA organization are leading. And on a personal basis, I'd really like to thank you for joining us today. I have tremendous personal and professional respect for you, having worked with you a number of years, know how busy you are, and want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, which, as you discussed, takes you all over the world to share a lot of the exciting opportunities and how you're approaching this and assisting all these organizations in achieving these goals across sustainability, across cost and reliability, as you laid out at the beginning of our discussion today. So Rich Powell, thank you again for joining us, and really appreciate your insights.
Thanks so much, Chuck. Huge thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation as always, and all of our collaborations over the past couple of years.
This is Deborah Channel from Smart Energy Decisions. We're really thrilled to have Constellation as part of Smart Energy Voices. I want to thank Chuck Hanna and the team from Constellation for making this miniseries possible. And as always, thank you to our listeners for being part of the Smart Energy Decisions community. If you enjoyed the episode, you can subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform, and don't forget to tell your colleagues and peers about it too. To learn about how you can become part of our online and in-person content, visit our website at smartenergydecisions.com. We're always excited to share these presentations from leaders of the energy transition. We do that in this podcast, on our website, and at our events, and it's all in the interest of helping you make those smart energy decisions.